Today we're going to be talking about certainty as contextual from Chapter 5 of Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. Stay tuned. All right, let's dive right in with a summary of this section. So Leonard starts out by stressing or reaffirming the idea that knowledge is always limited. We know some things, but not everything. And then he ties it to what we cover in the chapter on objectivity, where what we need to do, given that knowledge is limited, is that we need to reduce and integrate it in a specific context of knowledge. And the implication that's being drawn here is that that is what it means to validate an idea, that you don't need omniscience, you don't need to be God in order to know anything. You know something in a context, that we can't take a feature of consciousness, part of the identity of human consciousness, and use that to disqualify our ability to know. That's a precondition for what it means to know, so that we learn, we discover, we validate in a context. And what happens if you operate this way, that is, you learn things in a context and continue to learn more and more and expand your context, is that you find that later knowledge doesn't overturn older knowledge. It refines it, it amends it, it makes it more specific. We get more and more knowledge. We don't overturn the old knowledge. And that this is what gives rise or makes possible absolutism, but it's absolutism in a context, that there is no such thing as an acontextual absolute. That again, that is taking God as a standard of knowledge. Then we turn to a perspective on certain kinds of conclusions. So for some kinds of conclusions, we just go from a state of ignorance to a state of knowledge. So it's just, hey, Bob's here. How do I know that? Well, I turned and I saw him walk in the door. Or maybe I didn't, in which case I'm just ignorant. But there's no process, there's no kind of lengthy, timely process of accumulating evidence. But for some conclusions, there is. For some conclusions, over time, what we have to do is build up evidence and see where it leads. And so in that kind of context, we need new cognitive concepts, epistemological concepts that are helping us assess where are we in that chain of taking evidence to a conclusion. And that's where Leonard gives us the categories of possible, probable, and certain. And that certainty is achieved when an idea is conclusive, when we have a standard of proof that we have met, when the evidence is sufficient in order to say, yes, this of all the viable hypotheses, all the evidence points to this one. There's nothing suggesting another interpretation. And therefore, yeah, I'm certain of this conclusion. And in that context, when you've achieved certainty, then from the objectivist perspective, bringing in doubt is arbitrary. And that is true, even though it remains true that man is fallible, that we can make mistakes. But you can't leap from it's possible for man to make mistakes, Leonard says, to it's possible that you did in this particular instance. That you need specific evidence in order to introduce doubt. That doubt can't be arbitrary any more than anything else in human knowledge. All right, so I want to say a few words about certainty and proof. So there's a way in which you can refer to certainty as just kind of beating back skeptics, and it's more polemical, like, yes, I'm certain I exist, or I'm certain that, there's a sandwich in the refrigerator. But that, as Leonard talks about, the primary use of certainty is it's a perspective on evidence. It's that this evidence is such as to meet a standard of proof. And so here's how he formulates the issue. A conclusion is certain when the evidence in its favor is conclusive, i.e., when it has been logically validated. At this stage, one has gone beyond substantial evidence. Rather, the total of the available evidence points in a single direction, and this evidence fulfills the standard of proof. In such a context, there is nothing to suggest even the possibility of another interpretation. There are, therefore, no longer any grounds for doubt. And I think this formulation is good, but it can be unsatisfying, or at least it was unsatisfying to me when I first read it. But you have to realize that what he's doing here, he's giving the most general or universal perspective on what it means to achieve certainty, to prove something conclusively. And that's going to be different in different areas of life. So Leonard gives us an example that's more fleshed out and concrete or specific, which is, all right, here's what it would mean to have a standard of proof in a murder trial. It's motive, means, and opportunity. But you're not going to have motive, means, and opportunity as the standard of proof for like establishing the causes of the Great Recession or for proving the atomic theory. That part of the process of proving something is working out exactly what the standard of proof is going to be. And so, but what we get is this idea that it's all of the evidence points at one hypothesis, none points to any other, none's driving us to a different interpretation. But there's another element here that I want to stress. It's that you have to have reasons to think that you have like on the table the range of hypotheses. Harry Binswanger and How We Know talks about having a genus of hypotheses from which one is choosing between. What you can't do is this idea of like, all right, I have a hypothesis and the evidence seems to be consistent with it, so therefore I can regard my hypothesis as contextually certain. No, you have to have real reasons to think you know enough to be able to say, yeah, these are the hypotheses that are on the table, and then it's, yes, all of the evidence points in the direction of my hypotheses. It's sufficient in order to say this hypothesis is the one that's true, and therefore I can go from probable, let's say, to certain. All right, so let's turn to everybody's favorite topic when it comes to certainty and error. And let's put it as bluntly as possible. You can be certain and be wrong. And I think the best way to kind of tip our toe into the water here is to talk about a distinction that Leonard Peikoff has made, though I learned it from Harry Binswanger, and it's looking at the concepts of certain knowledge and truth. So with certainty, it's purely epistemological. That is, it's a statement about evidence. Its evidence has met the standard of proof in a given area. Whereas knowledge has an epistemological and a metaphysical component. There's a fact and you've grasped it, and you need both of those. It really has to be a fact, and you really do have to have grasped it. And then fact is purely metaphysical. That is, there can be facts facts are facts whether we know them or not. It's just the way reality is. And so then when it comes to certainty, this is why you can be certain and wrong, because it's a perspective on evidence. And the primary way in which you can be certain or wrong is going to be if you had insufficient evidence. Now, sometimes you just have, in most cases, when you have insufficient evidence, it's, yeah, I don't have enough evidence to be certain. But the way Harry will put it is, it's insufficient evidence that is apt to mislead. So that in kind of unusual circumstances. So the easiest kind of case you can think about is somebody who's deliberately trying to deceive you. And, the people who are kind of married for 50 years and it turns out like the husband was leading a double life. Now, often in those cases, you'll go back and think, I should have known and I was ignoring things. But you could imagine scenarios, and I'm sure there's some cases where somebody just manages to hide something really crucial from somebody, and you can think, I was, certain the person I was with was this kind of person, and it turned out they were not. But then there's another category is cases where you have the right method, that you understand logic, but you misapply it and you make a mistake applying it. So it's those are the kinds of ways in which you can, be certain and then end up, no, I was wrong. I lacked the evidence, or I made a mistake in applying the method. But now, if it turns out that, I was certain and, I was wrong, this is an advance. You're pushing your knowledge forward. And I think it's really important to have, more than that, actually, it's part of what you have to do, part of what objectivity requires in cases where you were certain and then you realize later, oh no, that was wrong, is that you have to really try to understand, well, how did I go wrong? What was my error? What was my mistake? And then you use that to improve your method going forward. And I think this is a really important perspective. We've been stressing since the beginning of OPAR, the way in which consciousness is a process of awareness and the way in which objectivity is to guide that process. But we've really highlighted that there's a process. And I think the kind of view of certainty as omniscient, it's the idea that no, knowledge shouldn't be a process. It's that we can just pluck it out at a point in time, and either it sees reality as God sees it, or it's not real knowledge. It's not real cognition. But you have to think about it as it's an ongoing process, and it's not a process that guarantees truth. It's the process that makes truth most likely and that is self-correcting when it comes to errors. And then if you think about our kind of normative epistemological concepts, they all have to be defined as they have to be defined in the context of an entity that is not omniscient, an entity that is fallible, that an entity with the human identity of consciousness. They all have to be defined in that context, and they only have meaning in that context. That for them to be norms, concepts like knowledge, truth, fact, they all have to be useful for an entity to help him undergo this self-correcting process over time. And so if you had a concept of certain or truth that or knowledge that said it was impossible to obtain any of these things, then you've gone really off the rails somewhere. So the issue with certainty then is not what conclusions are such that it's impossible that they're wrong. The right perspective is what conclusions am I entitled to regard as knowledge and build on and act on without doubt, without deliberation. That's going to be the real question, and that's the perspective that certainty is bringing in. It says for these kinds of conclusions, this is what it takes in order to be able to say, yes, this is knowledge, and I'm going to continue to move forward and use that knowledge and build on that knowledge. And that's what we're trying to establish when we're defining a standard of proof that is going to climax in certainty. All right, let's end on this. We've been talking about certainty and error, and now I want to turn to certainty as contextual. And I want to really stress that these are two different points. So we can think of certainty and error as focused on the issue that human beings are fallible. But now certainty and context, we're focused on the issue that we're not omniscient. So, to talk about error is to say, you can be certain it turns out, no, I was wrong. I got reality wrong. Certainty is contextual is to say that we learn in stages and that later discoveries don't overturn older discoveries, that knowledge builds on knowledge, and that what we get later is we qualify, we specify, we make more precise our earlier conclusions. But it's a perspective on the growth of knowledge versus going from knowledge to error, error to knowledge. And the reason I'm really stressing this is that this is an issue where I've heard some objectivists get it way wrong. And I'm pretty sympathetic because I think I've probably made some version of this error, not to the extremes. So let me give you one kind of thing that I've heard in the past. So it will be, okay, 500 years ago or whatever it was true in a context that the sun went around the earth. But in our current context of knowledge, no, the earth goes around the sun. And that is way wrong. That contextuality does not transform an error into knowledge. It doesn't transform a mistake into truth. It's when we're talking about context, what we're talking about is a truth building on a truth or making a truth refined and more specific. And this is really the point of the blood example. So with the blood type example, what Leonard Peikoff is stressing is that what was the right conclusion for scientists to have drawn when they discovered, say, that A bloods are compatible, when they discovered the whole issue of blood types. And here, the whole thing that we're exploring, what we're talking about is situations where you discover a causal factor, and yet you have reason to think there's other causal factors, or at least there might be other causal factors that you haven't discovered. So here's how Leonard formulates the point leading into the blood example. Quote, in any situation where there is reason to suspect that a variety of factors is relevant to the truth, only some of which are presently known, he is obliged to acknowledge this fact. So it's, let me triple underline that. It's where there's reason to suspect that a variety of factors is relevant to the truth. So if you think about the blood type example, we're talking about human biology. And this is something where researchers, doctors, they know that there's a ton we don't know, that the causality of the body is enormously complex, that there's just a gazillion factors. And I mean, that's true today, let alone back when blood types were discovered. And so it's, what is the right conclusion? How would you formulate a causal discovery in that kind of context? And the answer from the objectivist perspective is that it's in the present context of knowledge, this is the right conclusion to draw. So it's A, blood types are compatible. And then part of what your thought process is, or part of what you're amending it with is, and I'm going to keep exploring and look for new factors, and I'll qualify my conclusion accordingly. And so then you discover, oh, and as my context expands, there's cases where A bloods aren't compatible. And so I don't throw up my hands and say, well, all right, I guess we should just kind of quit and be sad. It's, all right, what's this new factor? And then we discover it. It's RH factor. And Onkar Ghate gives this example of like, this is actually how human beings function even in life. Like, you know, you have one of those keys that unlocks your car at a distance, and, you know, it works really well in Southern California. And then, you know, you drive to some place with harsh winters and you try to open your car door and it doesn't work. Well, it's not, well, I guess this doesn't open car doors. It's maybe there's another factor, and who knows, maybe it doesn't work. It opens a car door except in really cold weather. And so I've heard people push back against this on different grounds where they're trying to get that, no, it was an error. It was always wrong to say A bloods are compatible. That to say A bloods are compatible, what scientists meant, what the man in the street means by it, what common sense tells us is that A bloods all are and always will be compatible. And nope, we got to throw that out. And it's really important to think about like what OPAR is doing. So this is not a report journalistically on how people use things, but it's how we should think. What is the right way to conceptualize the issue? And what Leonard's arguing is that in a context where you discover a causal factor and have reasons to think there might be others that are relevant, then what you're legitimately entitled to draw is the conclusion that in the context of my knowledge, A bloods are compatible. Not that they are, always will be. That's completely unjustified. Now, it's a separate question of if scientists are actually doing what these people who are criticizing us are saying. I mean, it's certainly possible for a scientist, let alone a man in the street, to misconceptualize what they're doing. But I think it's revealing in this case that, you know, the person who discovered RH factors, one of them was one of the people who originally discovered blood types. And so it's not that he sat down and said, all right, A bloods are and always will be compatible. I'm going on break, and then, you know, quit his career. It's, no, this is an area that I'm going to keep exploring, looking for new factors associated with bloods. And it's, so in that context, it's not a big shock of, oh, there goes my old discovery. It's more like the, car key thing that's not working. It's, oh, here's another factor that I wasn't aware of. And so that's why the right perspective is, in my context of knowledge, this is the right conclusion to draw. And then you're learning more about what that context is and what conditions that causal factor does and doesn't apply, or does and doesn't play out the way that you're saying. And it's for that reason, by the way, that it's not you to say this about every conclusion, that sometimes you know all the causal factors, and there's nothing else that could be relevant. So, I mean, the most obvious example is you don't have to say, like, in the context of my knowledge, existence exists. No, I mean, the axioms, that's out. But I'd say that's true of all of, or at least most philosophic knowledge, that, you know, it wouldn't be in my context of knowledge, human beings should be free, or self-interest is the right moral code, that it's applying in a situation of you've identified or isolated a causal factor, and yet there's more that could be relevant. You're going to keep searching for more that's relevant. So with that, we're going to wrap up this video. And next time we are going to go to skepticism and mysticism, which is a polemical chapter. And I've skipped the polemical chapters up till now, but this is a really good one for many reasons. In part, it brings in the other polemical chapters in various ways. So I'm going to bring in some material from those that I think will help us integrate the objectivism's kind of criticism of alternatives. And so I think that should be really fun. In the meantime, be sure to like this video if you liked it. Hit that bell so you do not miss any of our future videos. And as always, the best way to stay in touch is to go to donswriting.com and sign up for the newsletter. Talk next time.